Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome along to our fourth Dean's Lecture for 2023. Great to have you all with us. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Jim Waterston. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education. I stress the Faculty of Education. We're in the midst of changing our name at the moment from the Melbourne Graduate School. We've had a soft change, and on November the 21st there'll be a very big celebration to recognise the centenary of the Faculty of Education being at the University of Melbourne. So it works in well as we change back to the original conception, and we're looking forward to all that comes with that, and we'll talk a lot more about that over the next few months. So welcome again to being here tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. And I also acknowledge the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. So let me get into this. I'm truly delighted to welcome our guest speaker tonight, award-winning journalist and broadcaster Jon Faine AM. Larissa and I had the pleasure to have lunch with Jon to prepare for this Dean's Lecture a few months ago now. It was quite a while ago. And the theme of the lunch was meant to be, helping Jon to plan a presentation that would have something to do with education. I haven't really seen where we ended up, but let me assure you that the title of The End of Civilisation as We Know It, is not quite what we discussed. So I'm as interested as anyone here tonight as to how this will go. So, but I know it'll be brilliant, so thank you. Jon's the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne, attached to the Melbourne Law School with a roving commission across the entire university. Until October 19, Jon was the host of the Agenda morning broadcast for ABC Radio for over 20 years. Before joining the ABC in 1989 to host the Law Report on Radio National, Jon practiced for 7 years in both commercial litigation and as a legal aid human rights advocate. Jon has published 2 oral histories, the travel bestseller From Here to There, which was written in 2010, telling of a road trip adventure with his younger son from Melbourne to London, and then most recently, Apollo and Thelma, a true tall tale, published in 2022, a uniquely Australian, beautifully told story. It shares a yarn that has enthralled Jon for 40 years, taking him from Melbourne's Depression-era slums to the isolation of the outback. We were also reminded by Jon that Apollo and Thelma is still available to be purchased in the shops. Hopefully you brought some tonight and you can do some signings, that'd be perfect. In addition, Jon has produced multiple opinion and commentary pieces for major newspapers, regular TV appearances and guest radio spots, as well as being script advisor for several films. Jon is also the recipient of many awards, including a member of the Order of Australia, the ABC Broadcaster of the Year in 2000, 3 times nominated for a Walkley Award.
Never won one.
Never. I said to Yvette, shall I say that tonight? So thank you for helping me out. The New South Wales Law Foundation Golden Gavel and the Monash University Distinguished Alumni. We won't actually hold that against you, seeing as you're at the University of Melbourne, but Jon sits alongside the journalism greats, and this was recognised in March this year when he received the Melbourne Press Club Lifetime Achievement Award at the 28th Quill Awards, an annual celebration of excellence in Victorian journalism. Some of you may be aware that following this very high note in Jon's media career, he has recently decided to accept a position on the Museum's Victoria Board. On the 6th of August, Jon wrote his final column for the Sunday Age, noting that serving the pleasure of a minister on a government board is inconsistent with being an independent scrutineer of that same government. It is not ethically possible to do both. So I'm sure that many in Melbourne and indeed nationally will miss your weekend thoughts and scribblings, as you put it. However, we congratulate you sincerely on your appointment and wish you great success in the role. For over 30 years, Jon has been in demand for keynote presentations, speeches, panel moderation and presentations, MC duties and guest lectures and public events. Specialising in complex matters of public policy, strategy, legal issues, technological challenge or cultural clashes, his work has covered every imaginable field. It's clear to see why tonight's Dean's Lecture has been over a year in development, given Jon's popularity and infinite commitments. And we thank him for making room in his very full calendar. So if you could now please join me in welcoming Mr. Jon Faine for what's going to be a very enthralling evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Sounds like a remarkable bloke that you just introduced. I don't recognise much of it, but it's very kind of you. I too want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I not just pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, but also express at a personal level my impatience for a treaty. And in order to arrive at a treaty, we need people with whom to entreat. And that's why we need a voice. Without a voice, we don't have a body with whom to commence the process of treaty. And why do we need treaty? We need a treaty in order to repair the damage of our colonial past, about which there's quite a lot in that book, Apollo and Thelma, because that took me on a somewhat unexpected journey. And as I write in the book, as it takes various twists and turns, I learned things I couldn't unlearn, and I discovered things I'd rather not have known about. But having found them, do I continue the silence and the lies that have characterised this still young nation and its evolution to something we should rightly be proud of, but at the same time we can't ignore what it's built on? Enough of that. It's just as well that this forum wasn't set for last night. Nobody would have been here. And it always astonishes me when there are people who are prepared to come along and listen to me waffle along, when you used to get 3.5 hours a day, 5 days a week for it, for nothing. But I'm sure it's the offer of some finger food and a free drink that attracted people as well, but I'm grateful to you and thank you. I'm probably one of the least qualified people to grace a stage at a Dean's lecture. I don't have a master's, I don't have a PhD, I didn't even get an honours degree. In fact, if truth be told, I scraped through my arts and law degrees doing the least amount of work possible, specialising in throwing frisbees, playing snooker and doing all the sex, drugs and rock and roll things that students should do, and paying very little attention to my studies until each year at September I had to cram in order to be allowed to stay. And my recurring experience was, gee, this stuff's really interesting. And I wish I'd paid attention during the year. At some point you'd think that the penny would have dropped, but it never did, and I pretty much devoted myself to anything except studying. But it all changed dramatically one day, in the most unexpected way, and from the most unexpected quarter, and I learned one of the best lessons of my entire education from someone who wasn't a teacher, and at a venue that wasn't a classroom. My parents, very dutiful, had gone overseas. My father was an academic at Monash. He was Professor of Microbiology, and he took a sabbatical and went overseas and foolishly left me in charge of their house, the dogs and their cars. And he never quite did discover why the whiskey was so pale and watered down and where all of his cigars had gone to, but we had some great parties. But along with the other things I was instructed to do while they were overseas, I was told in non-negotiable terms that I absolutely had to visit my father's elderly, blind, almost deaf, hunchback aunt at the Montefiore Homes in St Kilda Road, the Jewish community old age facility. And Auntie Fanny was very isolated because she was blind and she was deaf and she didn't have many visitors. And my mother very dutifully visited her, as did my father. And they told me, under no circumstances are you to forget to visit Auntie Fanny at least once a month while we're away. And begrudgingly, like a typical 20-whatever-year-old, I didn't want to do it. And I thought, oh, I'll be in so much trouble if I don't. I'll get in and out as fast as I can and I'll make sure that I tick that box. And I went and saw Auntie Fanny and sat down in her tiny little room. And I said, "It's Jonathan here." "Who?" she said. "It's Jonathan." "Who?" "Solly and Eva's son, Jonathan." "Oh, why aren't they here?" "Because they're overseas. I'm here instead." "And what are you doing now?" "I'm at university." "And what are you learning?" "I'm doing an arts degree and a law degree." "I didn't ask you what you're studying. What are you learning?" And I looked at this woman who was frail, bent over, and I thought, oh, shit. It's a bit of spark. And so I said, oh, well, I'm doing lots of things, and I rattled off some subjects, and one of them was that I was studying revolutions in my arts degree. And she said, what revolution? I said, well, we're doing the Russian Revolution. And my Auntie Fanny looked at me and she said, bah, it was no revolution. You know, they stole your Uncle Ernie's coat. I said, what? She said, yes. Ernie was studying accounting. He came home one day, he had a beautiful new coat, and they pushed him over in the gutter and they stole his coat. They weren't revolutionaries, they were just thugs. And off she went. And I was enthralled. And I thought, here I am at university, listening to someone in a lecture theatre and then going up into the stacks in the library and reading manuscripts. And here is my own flesh and blood, my father's aunt. She was there. What am I doing? And I went back again and again and again and visited Auntie Fanny. It's my father's birthday today, so I'm sorry. He died a few years ago. So one of the things that taught me was that there's lots of ways to learn. And in this institution and this part of this institution, you're taught and you teach people this is how to learn. And there's lots of ways to learn. Some people learn by doing. Some people learn by reading. Some people learn by listening. Some people don't learn at all. I always quote Mao, you know, if you want to know what an apple is, you can describe it, you can paint it, you can cut it, you can analyse and dissect it, you can reduce it to its physical properties and its constituent parts, or you can eat it. And the best way to understand an apple is to eat it. One of the problems that we face in this increasingly technologically complicated world is that things are happening faster than most of us can keep up. And there's not a person in this room, and with great respect, there's a certain demographic skew. There's not a person in this room, even the younger ones, who are not, we're all challenged. We're all challenged by the pace at which things are changing. And in the university context at the moment, one of the things I've been asked to grapple with is the challenge of artificial intelligence, ChatGPT and other brand names like that one. And what's it going to mean? And of course, the first flush of reaction to this extraordinary new technology was to say, oh my goodness, the students are going to cheat. Once we got past that, it dawned on us, and we've done some terrific exercises both with medicine, dentistry, health science, and also in the law school, where I've done some things in both of those two schools. We've discovered that the real issue is that the students we're training now are going to be working in a world where AI is as important as a telephone is or a laptop is to us now. And to put our fingers in our ears and go, it's horrible, it's terrible, it has to be stopped, it's just not going to work. What we have to do is learn how to harness it, how to work with it, and what is the best role for people to work with this AI. And I think I've kind of got to the point where I think the best thing to think of about AI is that it's a co-pilot. You still need a pilot, and we're training the pilots, and they have to know how best to use the tools. The problem, though, is that at the moment it's unregulated, and there's no accountability. And so some of the things that it's doing, it's done with no one keeping a check on it. So we had an address from a visiting Canadian health law expert in the law school. And they're already using AI in triage in emergency departments. So you go in and you talk to a human being, but they're also monitoring it with cameras and audio, and they're picking up what you're saying as cues for the automatically commissioning of tests. So as you talk to the triage person and they take your details, they are being monitored by AI, which then will say, if that's what you have described, you're going to need this, that and the other, and bing, 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 a human being doesn't need to intervene. But there's a bias built into this. There's an algorithmic bias. What happens if someone comes in, they have a disability, or someone comes in from a minority ethnic community, and so on and so forth. So part of what we're learning is how do we work on this. But if it makes a mistake, what's going to happen? So the accountability in the regulatory regime, it's an afterthought. In fact, it should be the other way around. And it reminds me of what happened 100 years ago. And we saw 100 years ago similar society-changing, civilisation-changing technology, which posed an enormous challenge. And that was when Herr Daimler and Herr Benz met each other. And one of them had the internal combustion engine, the other one had a carriage, and they put them together and got a self-propelling vehicle. My goodness, what an extraordinary thing. And it changed commerce. It changed communities, it changed families, it changed our world. But it took 15 years before anyone thought of road rules or driver's licences, regulations, and eventually insurance. So the regulatory regime for the motor car lagged behind the technology, and the people who were making a fortune from the new technology, and yes, I'm a petrol head for those of you who weren't aware, the people who were making a fortune from the introduction of this new technology, what did they say? They said exactly what Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and others are arguing today about their new technology. Oh no, don't impede progress from which they are extracting vast profits. They're not interested in the public, they're interested in their private domain. And we're falling for exactly the same trick. Henry Ford argued against regulating vehicles. People used to walk with a flag in front of the car because it was frightening horses. Do you remember those days? If you didn't, it's fascinating. Well, no, we don't personally remember it, but we might have learned about it. And so what we have to learn is how do we harness this technology but still maintain our value system, which is that we're in charge and we hold the key to how it's used rather than it dictating to us. And when I say it being the industry, not the technology, the computers won't dictate to us, but the industry. At the moment, they've become too powerful and no one will call them to account or call them for it. One of the major problems at the moment, in particular with social media, and AI will accentuate this, is anonymity online. And I'm absolutely bewildered. My legal background, I look at it, did a few defamation cases and then found that when I was working at the ABC, of course, it was front of mind every day. I only got sued a few times and it didn't cost much anyway. But anonymity online is causing untold harm. And I understand the argument, the counter-argument to anonymity is people say, oh, but hang on, I can only say these things if it's anonymous. I'm a persecuted minority group or I'm an oppressed political group, and if you strip away my anonymity, I can't say it because I'll be thrown in jail. And I go, yes, I understand that's an issue and we need to find a way to deal with it, but there is a greater harm at the moment being caused, and you're seeing that in particular in the skyrocketing rates of mental health distress amongst young people, bullying, just all the terrible things that are happening with kids on their phones, doing terrible things to each other and causing untold harm. And you have to take away that anonymity. You have to tackle the high-tech empires in order to do that. Part of the process of doing this is to unlock the grip that the boffins have at the moment on technology. It's everyone's technology, but they are calling the shots. And it reminds me also of what happens in a lot of other professions, law and medicine as classic examples. The gatekeepers in law and medicine must not be the ones who decide how the legal system and the medical system operate. It's our system, and you have to wrest control back from them. And the only way to do that, I think, is by education, and education of the people, of the users, in order to empower them to tackle the people who are the gatekeepers. One of the things they have to do is learn how to tell their story too. And essentially, and I never tire of doing this, although I'm running around the university like a headless chook trying to talk to people about it, you have to be able to tell a story in order to persuade people, to bring people with you. And whether you're a panel beater or a brain surgeon, if you can't explain what you're doing, you have no social licence. If you go and get your car fixed and they say it's going to be $20,000, just leave it here and sign a cheque, you're not going to do it. You're going to go, what? What are you doing for $20,000? And if someone wants to cut my head open and take out a ping pong ball of a tumour, I'm going to want to know a little more about what they're going to do and what are the side effects and how long is this going to affect me. I want to know before I give informed consent. You have to be able to tell your story. In the old days of the surgeon saying, I know what's best for you, shut up, lie down and we'll do it. Those days are long gone. And thank goodness for that. Part of that process involves tackling not just those monopolies of power, but also what follows from that monopoly of power. When people are too powerful, you end up with an ethics crisis. And do we have any better example than Australia's recent political history? And we've had, in recent times, and some of you will cringe at this, but I don't think there's any point avoiding it, we've had, until recently, the most corrupt government that I've ever known. And I'm only 67 next month, but I've never known anything like it. If I rattle off, and I had to write these down because otherwise I was going to forget. Robodebt, Stuart Robert, offshore detention contracts without going to tender, sports rorts, car park rorts, Barnaby's bonk ban. Oh my God. Sydney Airport, Triangle Land, the cashless card, the Great Barrier Reef, dollars without a tender or without even asking for it. The War Memorial, I mean, what's going on there? But the best one of all, that should be the first thing that's referred to the Anti-Corruption Commission if it hasn't already been. How was it that around that cabinet table, nobody raised an objection when one minister in the government, of all the Attorney General, told their colleagues, oh, I've just received a gift of $1 million and nobody needs to know who it's from. And that was Christian Porter when the ABC ran a program he didn't like. He wanted to sue them and he got $1 million, which was supposedly in a blind trust. It was no such thing. It was just in an account. And the fact that a minister in the government could put $1 million in his pocket to cover his personal expenses and say, nothing to see here, I cannot believe how that could have happened. And I've had the pleasure, and it's kind of a privilege to be able to sit face to face over lunch with someone whose name might rhyme with Josh Frydenberg and say, Josh, did you not at any stage think there was a problem with this? And how could no one raise a voice and say, excuse me, can't do that? And when you've got that level of example set in that leadership, or lack of leadership, absence of leadership, well, where do you go? After I left the ABC, one of the first things I was asked to do was to go to Port Moresby. And the Business Council of Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, invited me to go up there for their start of the 2020 year Prime Ministerial address. And they wanted an outsider to come in because none of the local journalists can stand up to the sort of pressure that happens in a small community. And they said, we want you to interview the Prime Minister in front of 500 people, including all the Cabinet, all the judges, all the diplomats, all the people from commerce, the business, the Chamber of Commerce. We want you to interview the Prime Minister, and as well as talking about mining and resource development, the threat of China in the Pacific, we want you to ask him about corruption. Will you do it? Sure, I said. Got a return ticket? Not a problem. So there's James Marape, who I've never met. He's delivering his initial speech, and then I interview him, and amongst the questions, I say to him, so Prime Minister, and this is 2020, so it's a few years ago. You say you're committed to an anti-corruption commission, unexplained wealth laws, asset forfeiture laws, the whole suite of anti-corruption measures. If you do it, you'll be the only country in the Asia-Pacific region, including Australia, to go that far. What motivates you? And his answer was an answer you would never hear from an Australian politician. He said, without hesitation, he said, I want my children to be proud of their name. And I looked at him and thought, wow, you're good. And not just good on the spin, but his fundamental Christian values drive him and make something like that a no-brainer. It's instinct. This is in one of the most renowned corrupt countries. And they now do have an anti-corruption commission. They started theirs before we got ours. And it's up and running. Now, what difference it makes, whether it gets to do things, who knows? Now, one of the things he understood was that, as the American poet and author Maya Angelou said, people will never remember what you did. They'll never remember what you said, but they'll always remember how you make them feel. And he understood that governing in PNG is not about constitutional nicety. It's about making people feel proud of their country and to trust their government, something we've lost sight of. It's always easier to frighten than it is to inform, and for too long in Australia we've had the politics of division. Democracy's fragility comes from the fact that it's a delicate machine. It requires constant maintenance. My submission to you is that education is the maintenance, and we have failed to keep up with the challenges of educating people in Australia about the fundamentals of democracy. Our standard of civics knowledge has collapsed, and part of the challenge for the Yes 23 referendum is a major uplift in people's understandings of how we work. And I'm afraid, even though I'm a fringe participant in, I chair some of the community meetings, that's all, they've left it too late to start. Now the strategy is there, I could bang on about this for ages, but their view is you've got to get all this cost of living stuff out of the way and then we can talk in a short, sharp campaign about the referendum. People don't want to hear us banging on about it for months and months and months. That may be right, it may be wrong, I don't know. But as the no campaign play the fear card and sow confusion, they're getting away with chipping away at the support base, which was higher. I always remind people that 75% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And you have to compromise in politics. It was Roosevelt who said, look, FDR, he said, politics is about doing what you can with what you've got at the time. It's not about, oh, we could have done this or we could have done that or we should have done this or we should have done that. It's about actually achieving change and doing it. And you have to embrace diversity to do that. You can't preach to the converted. You can't talk to yourselves and your friends and your supporters and people of the same mind. You actually have to reach out and you have to include people who otherwise might not already agree with you. Too much of politics is about talking to your friends and creating more enemies. It's about cliques. It's about alienating people by saying, well, you're a bad person, I'm not going to talk to you. And we've succumbed to that on both sides of politics. This is not a partisan commentary. And I think both sides talk to their bases instead of embracing diversity. It's often said you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but we've done that over and over again. We've said, well, if it doesn't reach this standard, I can't support it. We're seeing this with the referendum as well as with other things, housing policy. We saw it with climate policy. We've seen it over and over again. We saw it with the Republic. Those who didn't want a Republic. Who did King Charles support last night, I wonder? Those who didn't want a Republic managed to create division over what form of Republic it was, and then sat back and let the 65% of people who wanted a Republic squabble with each other to the point where we never got one, and we still don't, and there's no sign of us getting one. So one of the things I learned in 30 years at the ABC was that I was forced to be impartial by a statutory charter, an obligation, and it did me the world of good. It meant I got to work with a whole bunch of people who normally I would never break bread with, people whose views I didn't share and whose values were alien to me. And I discovered over and over again that they're not bad people. They just have a different worldview. Some of them were utterly horrible. Won't name anyone in particular, but apropos of nothing, it was me that gave Andrew Bolt his first opportunity to use the electronic media. He was just a print journo at the time and thought he was interesting, so we got him in and trained him up and started giving him a regular spot. We used to call the managers program prevention officers. And I was the most complained about person at the ABC for years, of which I was enormously proud. And my attitude when I was first told you're the most complained about person here, my attitude was, well, what are the rest of them doing? What's wrong with them? Lift your game. But the media loves conflict. The media magnifies conflict. And the model for too much media is to say, oh, there's an ant's nest. Aren't they beautiful, those ants? Look how exquisite they are and how much the structure of what goes on there. No one cares. Let's poke a stick in the ant's nest and then we can report that the ants seem very agitated and angry. And we've got a story. And there's far too much of that going on at the moment. Put the stick in the nest, stir things up, and then you've got a story that you can report about. The other thing that troubles me enormously at the moment is the false equivalence that's happening over and over again. Oh, so that's Anne Frank's view. We've heard from Anne Frank. What does Dr. Goebbels think? And there's a lot of that going on as well. And it deeply troubles me that this false equivalence has become house style in various organisations, where it's thought, oh, well, no matter how small this minority view is, we are going to give it equal footing. So how many people were at the Uluru Statement of the Heart meeting, for instance, as one very topical example? There were 230 or so delegates there. 7 walked out, led by Lydia Thorpe. Those 7 have been elevated to equal status with 223. Well, that's wrong. It shouldn't happen. It happened not just with the Republic, with emissions trading schemes, and compare that to where you do get a broad consensus by working with people, finding common ground, and you can introduce all sorts of reforms. And we've seen that in Victoria with voluntary assisted dying, which for years was in the too hard basket. And we're about to see it, it's my strong belief, we're about to see it with cannabis deregulation and probably legalisation along the California or Canadian model, where there will be shops. It will be a regulated product. It will be measured, metered, regulated, taxed, and you'll be able to go along and buy it. That's what's happening all around the world. We're very much behind in Australia, and particularly in some of these ridiculous backwaters that we've seen. It's the great irony, I think, or is it a paradox, but it's bizarre that the rebels of the Vietnam War generation have become the most selfish of our recent generations. We want everything. We want to control everything. So compared to our kids, for instance, we got free university education, we could leave uni and we would have careers waiting for us and jobs, we could afford to buy houses, we didn't have HECS debts, we didn't have the insecurity of casual work and the unaffordability of houses. And it reminds me of Malcolm Turnbull coming into the studio one day as Prime Minister to talk about all sorts of things, including housing policy. And I put to him, Prime Minister, you've got a real problem of housing affordability. What was this, 2017, I think it was. Look where we are now. And saying, you know, housing affordability, you and I can go to an auction on the weekend and bid against our own children, and we have the government subsidising us. We have an advantage. Surely that has to stop. And his answer was curious. He said, oh, what, Johnny, your kid's struggling to get into the housing market. A man of your means, you should be able to help them. And thank goodness I had the wherewithal to say, well, that's hardly a housing policy, is it, Prime Minister? The bank of mum and dad. And that's what we've done. It's the only country in the world where the government helps you buy a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth house, but not your first. It's got to stop. And we've become unbelievably selfish. My generation, me. Me. We want it all. And part of that, I think, is because the public square is broken down. And so that exchange of ideas, that contest of ideas that would normally happen, is not happening. And at some point, it's going to go bang. My time is running out. I think what we need to do is to borrow the language of the pandemic, and we're all epidemiologists now, aren't we? We need to build some greater civic immunity. We need to inoculate people against fake news. We need to improve people's ability to resist the infection that comes from some of these malaises I've been talking about. We have to reinforce rationality. And we have to lose some of the things that have led to some of the populist movements that have so empowered conspiracy theorists and so on. The worst thing we can do, and we have seen this mistake being made, sometimes we've had political leaders say, oh, well, how can anyone be so stupid? And everyone who is wondering about conspiracy theories thinks, oh, well, they just called me stupid, I'll show them. How dare they? What we have to do, in fact, going full circle, is we have to respect people's different motivations. We don't have to respect some of their crazy views, but you respect them as people. You don't push them away, you draw them in. I have a good friend in our neighbourhood His wife was refusing to let him get vaccinated. She was terrified. It took me an hour and a half sitting in the backyard talking to her about what is your concern. Oh, I read something on the internet, and being able to say, well, do you think that Nobel Prize winning scientists and the like, do you think they actually know anything? Do you think they just make it all up? No. Oh, well, there's a doctor in America. Yes, but there's thousands of doctors who disagree, and so on. It took an hour and a half, and in the end she burst into tears and said, I'm just scared. And a lot of it is driven by that very simple emotion. Going back to the referendum, I'm sorry to keep harking back to it, it's not going to be won by debating the finer points of constitutional law. It's not going to be one in the head, it's going to be one in the heart. And we have to get it back to that. And it's the same when you talk to Peter Doherty or Sharon Lewin, it's exactly the same. We have to be able to tell the story in a way people relate to. You don't throw a research paper at people and expect them to understand it when they've taken a lifetime to get to that level of understanding. Well, we're not going to be able to keep up. So you have to explain it to me in ways I understand and persuade me that I should trust you. John Howard taught me one of the other great lessons of my working life. And we were in the studio together. He was a great user of talk radio, John Howard. He maintained a perpetual conversation with the Australian public through talk radio. Wherever he went around the country, and he was utterly restless, wherever he went, he would drop into a radio studio, ABC or commercial, regional, the smallest one in the country, capital cities, didn't matter. Every week, somewhere, he would take talkback. And it kept him in touch. He was quite open about it. There's a chapter I wrote in a book no one's ever read, edited by Robert Mann, about how John Howard was so successful, and I wrote a chapter about talkback radio. I've never met anyone who's read it. Heartbreaking, isn't it? The time I spent doing the research on that, unbelievable. But John Howard maintained a perpetual conversation through talkback radio, and he loved coming into Melbourne because he always got such a great reception. And he came in one day, and extraordinary. I mean, most politicians would come into the studio and they'd have a ring binder, and it had notes in it with colour-coded little sort of, post-it notes, and, oh, he's going to ask me about the freeway. Hang on. Yes, OK, you're going to ask me about whatever. And they'd go to it, and usually hands shaking and anxious as all hell while buying time trying to find the figure. John Howard came in, nothing. Never had anything. Has an encyclopedic memory. And he came in this time, and as well as asking him questions about vertical fiscal imbalance and the war in Iraq, I had a real smart-ass question, which I was so proud of. It was at exactly the time of Cash for Comment. For those of you who don't remember, Cash for Comment was a Gold Walkley Award-winning story by Media Watch with Richard Ackland, where they discovered that certain radio presenters were secretly receiving payments from the banking industry to go easy on the banks. So when a caller would ring in and say, I've had a terrible time with the bank, John Laws, Alan Jones, Steve Price, Jeremy Cordeaux in Adelaide, a bunch of people were on the take and weren't revealing it, weren't disclosing it, but their job was then to go easy on the bank. And when this story broke, it was a massive scandal. It was referred off and investigated by the Australian Broadcasting Authority. They were all referred to the Broadcasting Tribunal. They were all found to have behaved corruptly and unethically. John Howard's in my studio the day after the findings. Vertical fiscal imbalance, war in Iraq. Prime Minister, yesterday the Broadcasting Tribunal found that Alan Jones, John Laws and others had behaved corruptly and unethically. I said that. He winced. He was quite friendly with them. Given those findings, will you continue to appear on their radio stations, on their programs? Good question? Yeah. Thank you very much. John Howard smiles, didn't often smile, looked at me and said, you know, John, I'm sure when I come in here, you think I'm coming in to talk to you. But I'm not. I'm coming in to talk to your audience. And as long as those gentlemen have an audience, I'll talk to them too. Game, set, match. John Howard understood more about what I was doing than I did. And it's fundamentally true. And you learn along the way The first thing you learn is you're not as clever as you think you are. Secondly, that you're always learning, and sometimes from the most improbable quarters. It might be John Howard, or it might be my Auntie Fanny. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's my absolute privilege to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of the faculty, on behalf of those of us gathered here this evening. We've had a wonderful experience and lecture tonight as part of this Dean's Lecture Series. John, I want to thank you for being so open and so generous in sharing stories, both from fumbling, or not even fumbling, but being caught out by Prime Ministers like Howard, being able to build on those learning experiences, sharing with us the story of Aunt Fanny and the notion that we are always learning. And what is really underpinning all of this is this notion of telling our story and telling it clearly and owning our stories. When we look at the lecture title, actually me now, but as we look at the lecture title and the end of civilisation has been pointed out in the questions, the answer is education, and I think those gathered in the room would absolutely agree with that and see that is an answer to the challenges that democracy is facing. But how we then address that and what we do as we work together in an interdisciplinary way, drawing on media, drawing on conversations, mobilising around important political, constitutional changes such as The Voice, is through the stories we can tell and the stories and the account of ourselves that we can give. So in sort of picking up what have been important learnings for me and perhaps also for you, thinking about being courageous, being open and brokering important debates and allowing diversity of voices to flourish so that we can hear those different stories. Remembering that learning is as much about how we feel through that learning experience as it is through any kind of deliberate pedagogical actions that we might take. And how we might connect with each other is really central to all of this. And when we listen to the stories that you've shared with us tonight, John, understanding that we have such an opportunity in this country for connection, we have such an opportunity for retelling narratives and mobilising new narratives. I want to thank you for raising that to our consciousness this evening and to really thinking now forward as we as an education community take this forward. What does it mean for us and what does it mean for the conversations we have in the days ahead, particularly as we lead up to this really important referendum. So thank you very much. And John, it gives me great pleasure to offer you a trophy. This is a very significant event, the Dean's Lecture Series, so we have the trophy.
Wow.
Much better than a walkway.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Jim. Much better. And also another gift which represents some beautiful art by Dixon Patton, which we have in our faculty. So we thank you very much. Small tokens of a great and very memorable Dean's Lecture for us. Thank you.
Thank you.